On the evening of February 6, 2014, 54-year-old entrepreneur Lexi Sachs lit 2 candles on top of a cake, then started singing Happy Birthday as she carried that cake out of the kitchen inside of her sprawling mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. 3 of Andra's 5 children joined in the singing and followed their mom. Andra was 5 foot 11 inches tall with dyed blonde hair, and she was the type of person who could take over any room she walked into. So even a simple chorus of Happy Birthday with her kids felt like a big production whenever Andra was leading it. As Andra, her 2 teenage daughters, and her 8-year-old son continued to sing Happy Birthday, they walked past a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Their huge 3-story house sat on top of a hill, and the windows looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Then Andra and the kids walked into the dining room, where Andra's ex-husband, Brad, was sitting at the dining room table smiling. Brad was over 6 feet tall, he had salt and pepper hair, and he almost always had a tan. Andra put the cake down on the table, and then she and the kids finished singing Happy Birthday. Brad leaned over the cake and blew out the 2 candles that were shaped like a 5 and a 7. The kids cheered, and Brad thanked them all for singing. Andra smiled at Brad, but she noticed he was hiding his hands just below the dining room table. She knew why Brad was doing it. It was because he didn't want the kids to see the tremors that were making his hands shake. 2 years earlier, Brad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a disorder of the central nervous system that can include symptoms like muscle stiffness, loss of balance, and tremors. And recently, Brad's symptoms had gotten worse. The kids knew their dad was dealing with Parkinson's, and so they were used to the changes in his movement that the disease could cause. But that night, Brad was celebrating his 57th birthday, and he just wanted the kids to have a good time and not worry about him. So he kept his hands out of sight while Andra cut up pieces of the cake and handed them out to the kids. Then Andra sat down next to Brad at the table, and she rubbed his back. Andra watched the kids laughing and eating their cake. Then she told Brad she wished their 2 oldest sons, who were away at college, could have come home to visit for his birthday so the whole family could be together. Brad said it was all right, and he pointed out that before they knew it, the girls would go off to college, and their 8-year-old boy would grow up, and it would just be the 2 of them together most of the time, like it had been at the beginning of their relationship. Andra and Brad had met almost 25 years earlier when they were both starting out as entrepreneurs in the growing tech industry. They were both very smart, and they had great minds for business, but other than that, they seemed like they didn't have much in common. Andra had grown up without a lot of money. In fact, there had been times as a child when her parents struggled just to make mortgage payments. As she got older, Andra had told herself she never wanted to experience anything like that when she was out on her own. So after she earned a business degree in college, she had worked hard to develop her sales skills and to learn about as many industries as she could in the hope that she would always have job security. Andra was full of energy, she could talk to anybody, and she could be intimidating. And those traits had helped her find success as a salesperson at a pretty young age. But Andra was also driven and fixated on success, so she had wanted to be her own boss and to make even more money. So by the time Andra had met Brad, she was already formulating plans to start and run her own company. Brad had first seen this tall, stunning, laser-focused woman at a computer convention back in 1990, and he was totally floored by her. Unlike Andra, Brad had come from money. He was the son of a legendary Southern California surfer, and Brad had wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. So he'd spent a big part of his life traveling and surfing waves on beaches all over the world. And Brad embraced the laid-back surfer attitude. He almost never raised his voice, he never looked like he was in a hurry to get anywhere, and nothing really seemed to stress him out. And so when Andra and Brad had met, it really was a case of opposites attracting. Brad had been drawn to Andra's drive and energy, and Andra had been drawn to Brad's kind of quiet, calm demeanor. The 2 had gotten married a year after they met, and they'd started a family soon after that. They had their first son, Miles, and he was followed 2 years later by his brother, Ashton. Then, a few years after that, Andra and Brad's first daughter, Lexi, was born. In the dining room, Andra and Brad watched 17-year-old Lexi gather up wrapped birthday presents with her 8-year-old brother, Landon. Andra appreciated that Lexi went out of her way to take care of her little brother because Andra spent a lot of time working and she wasn't always around. And as Brad's Parkinson's progressed, it was more difficult for him to do certain things around the house and to look after Landon all the time. But there was something about watching Lexi with Landon that always made Brad and Andra a little sad. It wasn't the kids' fault, but seeing them together brought up memories of the worst time in Brad and Andra's lives. Less than a year after Lexi had been born, Andra and Brad had welcomed another daughter, and as their family grew, their businesses had grown alongside it. Andra and Brad had started multiple companies together and also separately on their own. Then, Andra had used some of the profits from one of her companies to invest in rental properties and to build a massive real estate portfolio. In her time as an entrepreneur, Andra had often said it was easy to make money, but keeping it was the hard part. So she saw real estate as a way to protect her and her family's money and to build on the wealth that she had started to make from her other businesses. It turned out that Andra was a very savvy real estate investor, and soon after getting into that business, her investment properties were bringing in millions of dollars. So Andra, who had been determined never to face the financial struggles her parents had gone through, felt like she had already accomplished more than she could have hoped for. She was making more money than she had ever imagined, and she and Brad had just bought their first house together. It was a modest house compared to the mansion on the hill they would move into years later, but it had a beautiful pool and also had a hot tub. And the happiest part of Andra's life was that she and Brad had 2 perfect sons and 2 perfect daughters. But on a day in 1999, 15 years before Brad's family birthday party, 2-year-old Lexi and her 16-month-old sister had been at home with a nanny while Andra and Brad were working and the 2 boys were at school. While the nanny fed the baby in her high chair, Lexi had walked out of the house into the backyard and onto the deck by the pool and the hot tub. Inside the house, the nanny had seen Lexi out the window, so she grabbed the baby from the high chair and rushed outside. Lexi was close to the pool, and the nanny panicked. She put the baby down on the deck and then reached out and grabbed Lexi. But when the nanny had grabbed Lexi, the baby had somehow fallen off the deck into the hot tub and drowned. Following the death of their youngest child, Andra and Brad felt like everything they built together had just been destroyed. It didn't take long for them to start blaming each other for what had happened, and the tensions at home spilled into their work, and pretty soon each of them had tried to push the other one out of the businesses they owned together, and their marriage fell apart. Andra and Brad had gotten divorced, but things had only gotten worse from there. They had sued each other over business assets and personal finances, and Andra had even filed a report with police stating that Brad had tried to physically assault her. During this time, their 3 living children, Miles, Ashton, and Lexi, had clung to each other for support and tried to make both of their parents happy. Miles, the oldest, had seen himself as the one in charge, the one who was responsible for taking care of his younger siblings, and the other kids followed Miles's lead. But only a couple of years after the ugly divorce, Andra and Brad reconciled. Their friends and family had been shocked, but Andra and Brad seemed happy, and they had moved into the mansion on the hill in San Juan Capistrano that Andra had bought with money from her real estate investments. So the family was back together again. And then Andra and Brad had expanded the family by adopting Landon and his older sister. But after the divorce, Andra had sworn she would never share her money with Brad again, so she and Brad had not gotten remarried, and the house and most of the family's assets were still under Andra's name. In the dining room, Lexi and Landon brought in one final birthday present for Brad. It wasn't wrapped, but it had a bow on it, and when Brad saw it, he lit up. It was a large water bicycle designed to let him ride the ocean waves while sitting on top of it. Parkinson's disease had taken surfing away from Brad, but now, with this water bicycle, he'd be able to get back in the water. He thanked the kids for the great birthday party, then he turned to Andra, gave her a kiss, and thanked her for the incredible gift. They both knew a lot of people did not understand their relationship, an ex-husband and wife living together without getting remarried or sharing their money, but they didn't care, because Andra and Brad believed that they and their kids were as happy, successful, and loving as a family could be. On February 8th, 2014, so 2 nights after the birthday party, Andra helped Brad to their bedroom on the 3rd floor of the house. They hadn't told their younger kids yet, but Andra had recently purchased a new 1-story property, and she was going to sell the home they lived in. Andra and Brad knew the kids would be disappointed to move out of the mansion on top of the hill, but it was getting too hard for Brad to deal with the size of the house and to navigate all the stairs, and so Andra wanted a place where he could get to everything he needed on just 1 floor. While Andra and Brad went to their bedroom, 17-year-old Lexi walked into her little brother Landon's room on the 3rd floor and said goodnight to him as he got ready for bed. Then Lexi and her 15-year-old sister played with the family dogs and talked about school for a little bit before Lexi headed to her own bedroom, which was just down the hall from her brother's. Lexi got dressed for bed, she laid down, she looked at her phone, and sent a couple of text messages to friends. After a while, she put her phone on the bedside table, flipped off the lamp, and then went to sleep. A few hours later, at about 1:45 in the morning, Lexi woke up, startled. She thought she heard a loud noise coming from down the hall, but she didn't know if it was real or if maybe she'd been dreaming. Then, Lexi heard something bang against her bedroom door, and the door flew open. Without thinking, Lexi immediately held her breath and pulled the covers up over her head like she had done when she was a kid when she got scared. She heard a loud noise, but obviously couldn't see it, and then something smashed into the wall just above her. Lexi tried her best just to be totally still and not make a sound, but then she heard footsteps running down the hallway, followed by her little brother Landon screaming. Hearing her brother calling out made Lexi jump into action. She threw the covers off of her, she got out of her bed, ran into the hallway, when she saw Landon lying on his chest a few feet outside of his bedroom in the hallway, and he was screaming and crying and saying he couldn't feel his legs. Then Lexi heard footsteps again coming from behind her, and immediately her body tensed up. But then she turned around and saw it was just her sister running towards her. Lexi yelled for her sister to go call 911, so her sister turned around and ran back to her room on the 2nd floor to get her phone and make the call. Lexi turned around and looked down at Landon and promised him he would be just fine and that she needed to go somewhere but she'd be right back. And then she turned and ran down the hall towards her parents' room. And when Lexi got inside, her screams carried across the entire house. "45 minutes later, at about 2:30 in the morning, detectives Justin Montano and Mike Thompson of the Orange County Sheriff's Department drove past a set of large palm trees as they headed up the hill towards Andra and Brad's house. The house was surrounded by a wall with a gate, but the gate was open. Detective Montano drove through the open gate, and he and Thompson saw an ambulance and several squad cars parked out front. The detectives stepped out of their car and looked up at the 3-story mansion. Both of these detectives had handled cases in similar Orange County neighborhoods, but they were still taken aback by some of these huge multi-million-dollar properties like the Sachs' house. Montano and Thompson made their way up to the mansion and walked inside. One of the first officers who had arrived at the scene met them and led them through the foyer to a large staircase and up to the 3rd floor. Montano and Thompson walked down the 3rd floor hallway past Lexi's bedroom, and they saw members of the forensics team examining spots of blood on the floor outside of Landon's room. The detectives followed the officer to the main bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was open, so before they even stepped into the room, they could see inside, and they could see there was blood covering the back wall. And they could see there were 2 bodies still lying in the bed. They were Andra and Brad, and they both were deceased. Montano thanked the officer for leading them to the bedroom, and then he and Thompson stepped into the room and walked towards the bed. Neither of them could get over the amount of blood that was covering the sheets. Montano thought this looked more like a gangland hit than a typical homicide. A ballistics expert waved the detectives over and showed them multiple bullet casings he'd already found in the room, but there was no murder weapon left at the scene. Montano went back to the officer who had led them to the bedroom and asked him what he and the paramedics had found when they first entered the house. The officer said the victims' 3 children who lived in this house had all gathered in the hallway right outside of their parents' bedroom. The officer said it appeared that the 2 teenage girls were okay, but the 8-year-old boy had lost feeling and movement from the waist down. All 3 kids have been taken to the hospital. Montano nodded and thanked the officer again for his help. Then Montano and Thompson looked at the scene on the bed again, and for some reason they both had the same thought. Did the 2 teenage girls murder their parents and maybe paralyze their little brother in the process? The idea of that upset both detectives, but they couldn't rule it out. The detectives had a theory that the motive for most murders boiled down to one of three things: money, sex, or revenge. And in a mansion like this, in such a wealthy neighborhood, there was definitely a chance that the kids had gone after their parents to maybe get their money. So after spending hours at the crime scene and organizing a canvass of the neighborhood, Montano and Thompson decided to really begin their investigation by talking to the Sachs children. That morning, a few hours after Andra and Brad's bodies had been discovered, their 19-year-old son, Ashton, was sitting on his couch playing a video game inside of his one-bedroom condo in Seattle, Washington. Ashton was lanky, with straight brown hair that hung down over his forehead. It was a Sunday afternoon, and one of Ashton's favorite things to do on Sundays was to sit on his couch, smoke a little pot, and play the video game League of Legends for hours on end. And so he was doing that when his phone rang on the coffee table, and he glanced down from the TV and he saw it was his older brother, Miles, calling him. So Ashton paused his game and he answered his phone. The two brothers both lived in Washington, but they attended colleges on opposite sides of the state, so they didn't get to hang out very much. But they still made it a point to check in with each other fairly frequently, and they got along reasonably well, even though they were not really alike. Miles, who was 21 years old, had always been seen by his siblings as the golden boy of the family, and he definitely took after his mom when it came to business. Miles was already managing some of his mother's real estate properties in Washington, and he had dreams of starting his own company someday, just like his parents had done. Ashton was way more into computers than he was into business, so he'd gone to college in Seattle to study computer science, and he hoped he'd be able to get into a tech or gaming company when he was a bit older. When Ashton put the phone to his ear, he heard Miles's voice cracking on the other end, and he couldn't understand anything Miles was saying. Ashton asked Miles to slow down and to tell him what was going on. Then Miles, somewhat point blank, told Ashton that their parents had been found murdered, their brother was now in the hospital and couldn't feel his lower half, and their sisters were now talking to the police. Ashton just sat there in silence for a second. Then Miles told him he needed to fly home immediately and help take care of their younger siblings. Ashton had always seen Miles as the leader among the Sachs children. After all, Miles was the oldest and their parents had always trusted him, so Ashton, who was clearly in shock, said he would do whatever Miles thought was the right thing to do. Later that day, Miles and Ashton both flew from Washington to Orange County, California. And after they both arrived, they immediately went to the hospital to check on their brother, who was still in recovery. And then they reached out to the police. Several hours after they had arrived in Orange County, Miles and Ashton, the two oldest Sachs children, sat down in an office at the sheriff's station to talk to Detectives Montano and Thompson. Miles was significantly taller than his brother Ashton. He wore a dress shirt and slacks, and he had brown curly hair. Earlier that day, Montano and Thompson had talked to the boys' sisters, and they still considered them suspects, but police didn't have any evidence to hold them at that point. So the boys had gotten to see their sisters earlier, which made them feel a bit better than they had when they had left Washington. At the sheriff's station, Miles and Ashton looked like they were doing their best to hold everything together. But Montano and Thompson could tell, underneath their kind of tough exterior, they both seemed exhausted, and the detectives had no idea what they were going through after all they were hit with that day. So the detectives started by thanking the brothers for coming in, and then they gently asked them, where they had been when the rest of the family was at the house. Miles and Ashton explained that they had been in Washington, where they both went to college. Then Montano asked the brothers if they could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against their parents. Miles and Ashton looked at each other, and Miles nodded, and Ashton nodded back. It was like one of those moments where siblings can say a lot to each other without actually saying anything. Miles took a breath and then looked at Detective Montano and said there was a long list of people who had it out for their parents. A look of surprise came across both detectives' faces. In the short time they'd been working this case, everybody the police had talked to made it sound like Andra and Brad were very well liked and admired by just about everyone. But Miles said that just wasn't the case. He told detectives that his mother's very aggressive way of doing business had led her to make a lot of money and a lot of enemies over the years. There were investors who felt like Andra had cheated them out of money, there were clients who felt like she had ripped them off, and there were tenants in some of the rental properties Andra owned who believed she was an evil landlord. Miles thought most of the people who were angry at his mom were really just jealous of her success, or that they didn't understand how business worked. But once those people believed Andra had wronged them in some way, there was just no changing their minds. Then Montano asked if Miles or Ashton could name any particular person that was one of Andra and Brad's potential enemies. And Ashton said they would actually need a couple pieces of paper to be able to list everybody. By the end of the interview, Miles and Ashton had provided police with 2 pages filled with the names of previous business associates and renters who might have wanted to harm their parents. So, detectives Montano and Thompson immediately went back to their theory that most murders are about money, sex, or revenge. Their first instinct had been that one of the Sachs kids might have wanted to get their parents money, and so that was why they attacked them. But now, looking at all these names on these 2 pages, the detectives started to think that it was very likely that Brad and Andra might have been killed by someone who was out for revenge. In the days following Andra and Brad's murders, Montano and Thompson learned that the murder weapon had been a Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle. So part of the investigative team focused on tracking down that weapon in the hope it would lead them to the killer. During that time, Montano and Thompson concentrated on the list of people that Miles and Ashton had provided them. And as they did this, the detectives discovered that there was even more anger towards Andra and Brad than their sons may have even realized. While searching social media, the detectives found multiple posts from people celebrating Andra and Brad's deaths. Most of the people posting were disgruntled renters who had lived in properties that Andra owned. So Montano added all those people who were making posts like that to their list of suspects and started to work through that list. But out of all the people they had looked into, from social media to the lists of names the brothers had given them, one group of people in particular stood out to the detectives. They were board members who had worked with Andra and Brad at one of the first successful companies they had started together. It turned out that years earlier, the board of directors had kicked Andra out of her own company because they said her business tactics and what they called her destructive raging were damaging the business. Andra had not left without a fight, and she had threatened to sue everybody involved with the company. And so finally, the board had just given her a payout of $9 million to walk away quietly. But when the company had faced bankruptcy, the board had started going after Andra in court to get the company's $9 million back. So Montano and Thompson saw these board members as people who wanted both money and revenge. The detectives met with individuals from the board, and they almost all said the same thing. They thought Andra was a terrible person to do business with, but they were horrified by what happened to her and her husband and her son. Those interviews also led to a list of even more past business associates who had grievances with Andra and Brad. And so Montano and Thompson felt like they really were just swimming in names of potential suspects, and they still hadn't even ruled out Brad and Andra's daughters. The investigative team was willing to methodically go through the entire suspect list if necessary, but Montano and Thompson believed if they could just track down the murder weapon, they could propel the investigation forward a lot faster. So they started to delve into the cell phone records of everybody they thought could possibly be connected to the murders. And they caught what looked like a huge break. A cell phone call had been placed from a car driving on the street at the bottom of the hill just outside of Brad and Andra's mansion around the same time the murders had taken place. But, just like the murder weapon, the car that the phone call had been made from seemed to have vanished. About a week after Andra and Brad's murders, 4 of their 5 kids, so all the siblings minus Landon, who was in the hospital, stood huddled together at the front of a church in between their parents' coffins. Over the past several days, those 4 siblings had barely left each other's sides, and they had spent most of their time with their little brother, Landon, in his hospital room, until they had finally gotten the good news that Landon was going to live. However, doctors said he would not walk again. At the funeral, Miles, the oldest sibling, spoke first about his unique relationship with his mother. He called her Andra and not Mom because he felt the connection they shared went beyond that of just mother and son. They were also friends and business partners, and Andra had always treated him as an equal. After Miles spoke, he went back over to his sisters and wrapped his arms around them. He was much, much taller than both of them, and so it almost looked, as they were standing there, like Miles was their father and not their brother. Then Ashton, the other brother, stepped forward and took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and as he read the eulogy from this piece of paper, you could see his hands shaking. Ashton spoke about how lucky he had been to have parents like Andra and Brad, but for most of the time that Ashton spoke, he spent his time talking about his little brother, Landon, and how whoever had done this had robbed an 8-year-old boy of the chance to grow up with a mom and dad, and how they had also robbed him of the use of his legs. It was just so tragic. After Ashton had finished talking, people in the church were openly sobbing as they offered condolences to all the kids. And even though those people knew the family had money, they wondered who would take care of the kids, and how they would ever move on from what had just happened to their parents. In the days following the funeral, the other Sachs siblings began to notice a change come over Miles. It was like he stopped being a normal older brother and switched into business mode like they had seen their mom do before. Miles met with authorities so that he and Ashton could obtain legal guardianship over their younger siblings. Then he moved all of the kids out of the mansion on the hill and into that one-story home Andra had bought with the intention of making Brad's life a bit easier. The other kids were angry about the move, but Miles said it was the right financial choice to make. This way, he could complete the sale of the mansion like his mom had intended, and the family would make millions of dollars. The kids were confused and upset, but they'd always looked up to Miles, and he seemed to have a clear plan, and he assured them that everything he was doing was in their best interest. So, in the span of a couple weeks, the Sachs kids had lost and buried their parents, and had moved out of their beloved house, and the younger kids had started having to answer to their own older brother, Miles, as if he was their parent. While Miles tried to get the family situated in their new home, he also reached out to his parents' lawyers to make sure he would have control of Andra's rental properties. Again, Miles said everything he was doing was just to make sure the rest of the kids would be taken care of and that they wouldn't have to worry about their financial futures now that their parents were gone. But even some of the kids' aunts and uncles thought Miles's behavior following the death of his parents was very bizarre. They understood that he did have a lot in common with Andra when it came to doing business, just being really aggressive and straightforward, but it almost seemed like he had already moved on from grieving, which just seemed impossible. Miles's actions didn't go unnoticed by police either, so Montano and Thompson returned to the idea that maybe money had been the motive for murder, and they wondered if maybe Miles had killed his parents just to get a hold of their financial assets and their companies. But Miles, and also his brother Ashton's alibis, had both checked out. People had seen them both in Washington on the morning of the murders. So Montano and Thompson just kept pursuing the two pieces of evidence that they thought would break the case wide open: the Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle used in the murders, and the car that someone had placed a call from just outside of the mansion at the time of the murders. About 3 weeks into the investigation, Montano and Thompson were sitting together at the sheriff's station reviewing the steps they had taken so far. They were still pursuing every lead they had, including the seemingly countless number of enemies that Andra and Brad had made over their years of doing business. Just then, Montano's phone rang. He picked it up, and a member of the investigative team was on the other line, and the officer sounded excited. He said cell phone records had finally led them to a man who was in possession of the car that phone call outside of the Sachs house had been made from. Montano hung up, and the police got right to work securing a warrant to search the car that investigators had just tracked down. When the warrant came through, Montano and Thompson and other members of the team went to do a full search of the car. And when police popped the trunk of that car, they found a pile of clothes and also a Ruger semi-automatic rifle inside. They now knew who had murdered Andra and Brad. Based on cell phone records, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence found at the scene of the crime and in that car, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened when somebody murdered Brad and Andra Sachs in the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014. At 1:30 a.m. on February 9th, the killer drove their white Toyota Prius slowly down the road at the bottom of the hill right below Andra and Brad's mansion. The Prius didn't make much noise, but the killer didn't really need to worry about being heard or seen anyway, because the Sachs' mansion was totally secluded and it sat on an acre of land, so nobody really lived that close to them. The killer parked the Prius at the bottom of the hill and stepped outside. There was a light, cool breeze coming off the ocean, and it was a very mild 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The killer wore jeans, a t-shirt, and gloves, and they had a knit hat pulled down almost to their eyes. The killer then walked around their car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a loaded Ruger semi-automatic rifle with a sling on it. The killer slung the rifle over his shoulder, closed the trunk, and then began walking up the hill towards the mansion. The moonlight shone through the palm trees, and the killer could hear waves crashing on the beach nearby. Everything felt so calm, but the killer's heart was pounding in their chest. The killer reached the top of the hill and came to the wall that surrounded the front of the house. The killer stretched out their arms and grabbed the top of the wall and then pulled themselves up and climbed over it into the front yard. The porch was lit, but the rest of the house looked dark. The killer stayed low and ran to the front door. They opened the door and walked into the large foyer in the front of the house. The huge windows allowed enough light into the house for the killer to clearly see the staircase leading up to the third floor. But the killer didn't move. Instead, they just stood there silently for several minutes. And then the killer began to pace around the first floor, deciding what to do next. Finally, after the killer had been on the first floor for nearly 15 minutes, they took a deep breath, they unslung their rifle, and marched upstairs to the third floor. The killer walked quickly down the hallway of the third floor towards the main bedroom. They hesitated when they reached the closed bedroom door. But after taking a breath to steady themselves, the killer reached down with one hand, they opened the door, they stepped into the open doorway, raised their rifle, and began to fire. Bullets riddled Andra and Brad while they slept, and blood spattered the walls and soaked the sheets. The killer had fired almost 25 bullets into the room before they stepped back out of the doorway. But when the killer stopped shooting Andra and Brad and they turned around, they saw a little boy running the opposite way down the hall. So the killer just raised the rifle again and fired off 2 shots, and the boy fell to the ground. Then the killer walked further down the hall past the boy, who was now writhing in pain on the ground, and came to another closed door. They kicked the door open and fired a shot blindly into the dark room. That bullet struck the wall just above the bed where 17-year-old Lexi was hiding under the covers. Then the killer heard the little boy he had shot screaming in the hall right behind him, so the killer just slung the gun on their back again, ran down the hall, and flew down the stairs. The killer reached the first floor, their head was pounding, their ears were ringing, and they were out of breath. But they heard movement on the floors above them, so they ran out the front door and across the yard. They reached the wall, pulled themselves up, and climbed over it. Then they ran down the hill back to their car. The killer opened the trunk, took the rifle off their back, and chucked it inside. They pulled off their knit hat as well and tossed it in with the gun. Then they took off all their clothes and chucked them in the trunk, and then grabbed some fresh clothes from the trunk and put those on. Then the killer hopped into the driver's seat of the Prius, started up the engine, and hit the gas. Then, as they were driving away from the house, the killer grabbed their cell phone from the passenger seat and made a quick call. The killer's head was still pounding, and they still felt like they couldn't breathe, but they knew their night was not over yet. So the killer tried to focus. They drove across town to an apartment building and pulled the Prius into a parking garage. They parked, got out of the car, and then walked a few minutes towards a major street nearby and found a cab waiting for them. The killer climbed inside, and the cab drove them to the airport. Hours later, at about 10 a.m., the killer landed in Washington state. They caught a cab at the airport and drove home. When they got home, they made sure their neighbors physically saw them, and they also texted one of their closest friends in the area just to make a show that they were in Washington and not in California. Then the killer headed inside of their place, sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and started playing League of Legends. 19-year-old Ashton Sachs had murdered his parents, he had shot and paralyzed his little brother Landon, and fired a gun into his sister Lexi's room that easily could have hit her. It turned out Ashton had always deeply resented the way his parents treated his older brother, Miles. Ashton felt like Miles was treated like the golden boy, and his parents treated him, Ashton, like a failure. And that resentment had festered for years until Ashton started to consider murdering his parents in cold blood. Ashton went so far as to do serious research into different types of weapons and to figure out the differences between first and second-degree murder. Then Ashton had gone out and actually bought a semi-automatic rifle. But even after he'd gotten the gun, Ashton still wasn't sure he could actually go through with killing his mom and dad. He felt like he hated them, and he blamed them for a lot of his shortcomings, but he just didn't know if he could actually pull the trigger and end their lives. But then, the day after Brad's 57th birthday, Andra had texted Ashton to tell him how disappointed she was that he hadn't even called to wish his father a happy birthday. Ashton, very sarcastically, said that he only forgot it was his dad's birthday because his dad had forgotten he had a second son a long time ago. This led to an argument between Ashton and Andra, and Ashton finally decided at the end of that argument to go through with his plan. On the day before the murders, Ashton had driven his white Prius 18 hours from Seattle to San Juan Capistrano, California. He waited patiently in town for a few more hours, and then he carried out the murders in the early morning. Ashton had arranged for a cab to meet him and take him to the airport, and for a transportation company to drive the Prius back to Seattle and to keep it for him until he was ready to pick it up. So, immediately after the murders, he called that transportation company to verify the address where he would leave the car for them. Then he had dropped the car off in that parking garage, met the cab, and flew home. And it was that phone call to the transportation company that he made right after killing his parents that led police to Ashton. Using cell phone data, they tracked down the owner of the transportation company, and they learned that he had Ashton's white Prius in his possession. Then the search of Ashton's car led police to the murder weapon. When police had initially questioned Ashton, they believed he had been in Seattle on the morning following the murder. But the discovery of the Prius undercut that alibi and made it clear that he would have had time to commit the murders and fly home by the time he had been seen in Seattle. But before police arrested Ashton, they wanted to make sure they had an airtight case that would lead to a conviction. So they dug deeper into his life. It turned out that Ashton had dropped out of college without telling any of his family, and that he had started to isolate himself from most of the people around him. Police also searched his internet history and found all the research on weapons and the different degrees of murder and what each one means, and so police believed they had more than enough evidence against him. When police arrested Ashton, it didn't take long for him to confess. But he made it clear that he had not just killed his parents because he thought they liked Miles better than him. Ashton said his parents had always made him feel like he was weak. He said dating back to the time when he was just a little kid and his baby sister had drowned in the hot tub, his parents didn't seem to care about how upset he was, or even try to get him some help to deal with the grief he was going through. And then, not long before the actual murders, Ashton had gone through this very bad breakup with his girlfriend and gotten really depressed, and he had tried to take his own life by overdosing on painkillers. And Ashton said he felt like his parents didn't really even care. While the other children had a totally different view of Andra and Brad, Ashton felt like murdering his parents was his way of getting revenge on them for all the times they'd made him feel unimportant. Ashton was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100-year sentence for what the court referred to as special circumstances surrounding the use of firearms. As of 2022, Miles, the oldest sibling, was still looking after his younger siblings like he was their parent. And now at 17 years old, Landon, who was paralyzed from being shot, became one of the top 20 wheelchair tennis players in the entire United States, and he hopes one day he'll be able to compete at Wimbledon. In the early 1950s, Harold Alexander, who was a young stonemason living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George Reel. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society. This group, which never had a large membership at any point in their short history, was rooted in the Christian faith, but their views were far more extreme than the average Christian congregation. For example, many Christians believe in the concept of self-denial, which in layman's terms means to deny oneself some personal human pleasures, like certain sexual practices or the overindulgence of food or drinking, and all of this is done to gain favor with God. But George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively and so literally that nobody in the society could really have a life of their own. All they could do to adhere to their society's very strict rules was to worship God 24/7. In addition to their very severe lifestyles, members of the Lorber Society also believed that anybody outside of their small society was basically evil. So Harold meets George. It's unclear exactly how he meets George, but he does, and immediately Harold is blown away by George. He thinks he's totally incredible, he's so charismatic, and apparently George felt equally highly about Harold. And so right away they have this friendship, they strike up, and Harold and his wife Dragma, they end up joining the Lorber Society, and they completely give themselves over to this very intense lifestyle, and they listen to everything George tells them to do. And then very quickly after Harold and his wife had joined this society, their leader, George, became very ill, and it became clear he was going to die soon. When George was on his deathbed, Harold went to visit him, and after speaking with him privately in this room, Harold emerges and he tells his wife that George has told him that he is going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society once George passes away. And so his wife accepts this, as does the rest of the society members, and then after George actually does die, everyone in the society just turns towards Harold and begins listening to him and following him. It's worth noting that we don't know for sure if George really did tell Harold that he was going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society, or if Harold just made that up because he knew George was going to die soon and he could kind of get away with stealing that title. Over the next few years that Harold was in charge of the Lorber Society, he began introducing a new concept to the members. He would continuously tell them that they needed to be ready for when the next prophet of God returned to the earth. Harold told his members that when this happened, 1, Harold would know immediately and he would tell them, and 2, whatever this prophet wanted, no matter how confusing or crazy or terrible, they had to do it without question because this was God's will. In 1953, so roughly a year or two after Harold has taken over the Lorber Society, he and his wife, Dragma, have their second child. It's their first boy and they name him Frank. And as soon as this child is born, Harold looks at him and determines that this boy, his son, is the prophet they have all been waiting for. And so he tells his wife and he tells the members of the Lorber Society that his son, Frank, is the prophet of God, and everyone across the board completely accepts it. As the prophet, Frank, grew up, he was shamelessly worshipped and waited on 24/7 by the members of the Lorber Society and his own family. And so naturally, this had a profound impact on the way Frank thought and how he behaved. By the time Frank was at the age of grade school children, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to kind of boss his family around more than he really needed to, especially his 3 sisters and his mother. But no one ever intervened because, again, this is the prophet of God and he can do whatever he wants.
When Frank turned 16, he started thinking about girls and sex, but he was conflicted because he had been taught everybody outside of this society he was a part of were evil. And so he didn't want to pollute himself by having sex with these evil women. And so he went to his father and told him that he wants to start having sex with his mother and his sisters in order to stay pure. And his father, Harold, not only embraced the idea, he encouraged it. And in fact, he would often join in with his son during the sexual intercourse. As for the 4 Alexander women, they completely accepted their new roles as sexual objects because they believed by doing whatever Frank the prophet wanted, they were serving God. Eventually, one of the sisters began talking to some of her very few friends at school about how she was kind of jealous of her other sisters for all the attention they were getting from Frank. And so the friends kind of picked up on this strange relationship between the siblings, and before long, rumors had started about there being some incestuous relations inside of this family, and those rumors eventually made their way to the parents of students, and then from the parents, that made its way to the police, and before long, Harold had discovered that the Hamburg police were about to launch an investigation into his family. And at the same time, Harold also discovered that members of the Lorber Society, they had heard about these incest rumors as well, and they had their own suspicions already, and they were not on board with incest. And so they were very clearly starting to distance themselves from Harold and his family. And so it was pretty clear to Harold that the writing was on the wall. He and his family were no longer welcome in Hamburg. And so he goes to the Lorber Society and kind of retires and says, I'm leaving. You need to find yourself a new leader of this society. And then he and his family completely broke ties with the Lorber Society. They left Hamburg and fled south to Santa Cruz, which is a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. And so they settle into this little apartment inside of this busy city, and very quickly they fell back into their old routines of constantly worshiping Frank, the prophet of God, despite the fact that they were no longer affiliated with the Lorber Society, and so their actions were now being driven by their own personal belief system. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter Trankler was at his villa, which was located not far from where the Alexanders lived, when he heard a knock at his front door. When he opened the front door, he saw there were these 2 men who he didn't recognize, who were covered head to toe in what looked like mud. And at first, he was totally taken aback by their appearance and almost wanted to just shut the door. But in order to be polite, he kept the door slightly open and said, hey, how can I help you guys? And the 2 men would introduce themselves as Harold and Frank Alexander, and they were there to speak with one of their family members, Sabine. Sabine was one of Frank's 2 younger sisters, and she worked for the doctor as a housemaid. And so the doctor, he didn't know any of Sabine's family members, so he just kind of took their request at face value and said, hold on, let me go get her. And so he leaves the front door, he goes into the kitchen, and he finds Sabine, this 15-year-old girl, and he tells her that your father and your brother are waiting for you outside, they want to talk to you. And so Sabine, without saying a word, puts her knife and the food down. She walks out of the kitchen with the doctor, and as they're walking towards the front door, the doctor stops about 10 or 15 feet away from the front door to kind of allow Sabine to walk up and have a semi-private conversation with her relatives, although they're still inside of his house, so he didn't want to go too far. And so the doctor is standing maybe 15 feet away, wondering if he should just turn around or maybe just go into the other room to let them speak, when he overhears the father, Harold, say something truly horrific to his daughter. It was so shocking that the doctor stopped what he was doing, turned, and looked directly at Sabine to see how she was going to react to what she just heard. But to the doctor's absolute shock, Sabine didn't break down and start crying or start screaming out in pain or anguish. Instead, she reached out and grabbed her father's muddy hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And then the 2 embraced. The doctor stood there totally shocked, staring at these people, wondering what the heck they're doing. Why are they here? What are they talking about? Is this really happening? And then he just kind of blurts out, "Hey, I'll be right back. Stay right there." And then the doctor turned around and darted out of the front hall into another room where he barricaded himself inside, and then he called the police. When the police showed up just a few minutes later, they rolled into the front lot and they saw Harold, Frank, and Sabine were still just casually standing in the front doorway of the doctor's villa, seemingly not really trying to go anywhere or do anything. And so the police get out of their car, they walk up to the trio and they say, "What's going on? What are you doing here?" And Harold very calmly and casually tells one of the officers the same horrible thing that the doctor overheard him saying to Sabine. Except this time, Harold specified to the officers where this horrible thing took place. He said it happened inside of their apartment. The police were shocked at Harold's candidness and the fact that his two kids were standing right next to him and they're hearing what their father is saying. They too are just totally detached and very calm, as if nothing their father is saying is having any effect on them. It's just totally business as usual. And so the police asked Harold to repeat the story a few times to make sure they were hearing him correctly, and then they just arrested Harold and his two kids. After the three Alexanders were brought to the police station, 3 other police officers were sent over to the Alexanders' apartment in Santa Cruz to see if what Harold had said was actually true. And when these officers opened the front door to that apartment, they immediately could tell it was all true. The following is the story of what happened inside of that apartment based on the testimony given by Frank and Harold. On December 21st, 1970, so that's one day before Frank and Harold arrived on the doorstep of the doctor's villa, the father and son were home in their apartment with the mother, Dragma, as well as 2 of the 3 sisters. It was 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra. The other sister, Sabine, she was over at the doctor's villa. She was staying with him for a couple of days while she worked there. At some point that afternoon, Dragma and Harold left the living room and went into one of the bedrooms to lie down and take a nap. And after they lie down, Frank, for some reason, gets up from the living room and walks into the bedroom and sits down on the edge of the bed and just stares down at his mother. And when his mother rolls over and looks up at her son, Frank would later tell police that the look she gave him was suggestive and it was offensive to Frank, and he believed she was not permitted to look at him that way. And so in this moment that she's looking at him, he said he instinctively knew that the killing hour was upon them. The killing hour was not a Lorber Society concept. It was something that Frank and most likely Harold had come up with, and the rest of the family, the mother and the 3 sisters, had totally accepted. According to Frank and Harold, women were impure, and the only way to purify them, i.e. send them to heaven and not hell, was to murder them. And so it was just fundamentally understood in the Alexander household that at some point, Frank was going to declare that the killing hour was upon them. And when that happened, all the women in the household were told to stop what they were doing and wait for Frank to sacrifice them. Meaning, wait for Frank to ritualistically kill them. So after Frank has seen this offensive look on his mother's face, he now feels like the killing hour is upon them, and so he literally announces it to his mother and to his father, who's right next to her, and then Frank grabs a nearby wooden coat hanger and strikes his mother on the top of her head. Now, his mother, she's heard that the killing hour is upon them, and he's starting to beat her, and so what does she do? She follows the rules. She flips herself over onto her stomach, puts her hands down by her side, and lays flat and still so Frank can more easily kill her. And so Frank begins wailing on the back of his mother's head with this wooden coat hanger, while his father, Harold, excitedly leaps out of the bed, doesn't try to stop what's going on. He runs into the living room and he begins very enthusiastically playing the organ. An organ is like a piano that's played a lot of times inside of Christian churches. And so with all this commotion going on in the house, the other 2 sisters that were there, Marina and Petra, they come out of their bedrooms into the living room. They see their father playing the organ, and they look into the bedroom where they hear all this noise, and it's Frank murdering their mother. And they're looking at this happening. They're not doing anything. They're just staring at it. And then their father says to them, "The killing hour is upon us. You need to get ready." And so the girls, when they hear this, they know the rules. And so they stop watching this attack, and they make their way over to the center of the living room, and they sit down cross-legged, and they begin to patiently wait their turn. After a while, Frank stopped beating his mother, who was now unconscious or perhaps even dead, and he walked out of the bedroom into the living room where he saw his father on the organ, and he saw his 2 sisters sitting on the ground. And so without any hesitation, he walks over to Marina, the older one, the 18-year-old, and he begins hitting her on the top of the head until she slouches over onto the ground motionless. And then he turns to the younger one, Petra, the 15-year-old, and he does the same thing to her until she's laying on the ground motionless. After this, Frank stands up and he leaves the living room and goes into the kitchen where he retrieves a small knife, pruning shears, and a hammer. At this point, it's likely that 1 or 2 of the Alexander women were still alive. And so Frank, he comes back into the living room with these tools in hand, and with the organs blaring in the background, he begins to systematically hack off the breasts and genitals of his two sisters and his mother. And apparently this was a very slow and physically difficult task, and so he and his father Harold began switching off. One person would be on the organs while the other was mutilating, and they would switch back and forth until all of the offending parts on these three women had been removed and nailed to the wall. The last mutilation this father and son committed was to cut the heart out of the mother, Dragma, and they wrapped it up in a cord and then nailed this cord to the wall as well. Then, with the three Alexander women either dead or close to death, the father and son began running around the apartment, yelling and singing and rejoicing. They were extremely proud of what they had just done. Later that night, they left the apartment and slept in another property that they owned, and then the following day, December 22nd, they went to the doctor's villa to tell Sabine the good news. And so they knock on the door, the doctor answers, he goes back and gets Sabine. Sabine walks up, and Harold, her father, says to her, "Sabine, we wanted to tell you right away that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." To which Sabine walks up to him, takes her father's hand, presses it to her cheek, and says, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." This, of course, is what the doctor saw and overheard that was so horrible and prompted him to call the police. It was also the moment when he realized that was not mud all over these two men. That was their family members' blood. Psychiatrists would ultimately determine that Frank and Harold were not mentally fit to stand trial, and so they were both committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. Both men never showed any remorse or regret about what they had done. In fact, they continued to justify their actions by saying, because of them, these three women got to go to heaven. As for the one surviving daughter, Sabine, she pleaded with authorities to let her go live with her brother and her father in this asylum, but they rejected this request and sent her to live in a convent, which is a building that nuns live in, and no one really knows what happened to her after that. Shockingly, in 1990, so roughly 20 years after Frank and Harold were put into this asylum, they managed to escape, and they were never caught. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Someone in This Family Has a Secret. Strongsville, Ohio used to be just another typical quiet American suburb. Nice homes, nice families, nice restaurants, and a mall. But in late 2017, a discovery was made in Strongsville that put this town on the map in the worst way possible. To understand this discovery, we need to go back to early 2016 when this town's nightmare began. In early 2016, two longtime Strongsville residents, Bruce and Melinda Pleskovic, received some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter named Anna and her 20-year-old fiance named Jeff had just told them they were expecting a baby girl. And so Bruce and Melinda were totally excited about the prospect of finally becoming grandparents, but at the same time, they knew Anna and Jeff did not have very much money. Anna still lived at home with Bruce and Melinda. She did have a job, but she made very little money. She was a waitress at a local Applebee's restaurant. And as for Jeff, he had a better job working as a service technician for a heating and air company, but he didn't have enough money to support him and Anna. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to move out of his parents' home. He was still living with them on the other side of Strongsville. And so this couple, they're really excited about their baby, but Bruce and Melinda are thinking, we really got to find a way to support them because they are just not prepared for this first child. And so Bruce and Melinda, they talked it over and they decided the best way to support this young couple was to tell their daughter if she wanted to, she could invite Jeff to come stay at their house. That way, the two of them could be together, and once they had their daughter, Bruce and Melinda could be the great-grandparents and help take care of the baby, and in general, this would allow the couple to just continue to save money and move out when they were ready. And so when they told Anna they were willing to do this, Anna was so happy, she was so grateful. She called Jeff, and Jeff was equally happy and grateful and said, "Yes, I would love to move in with you guys." So it took several months, but finally in June of 2016, which was the same month that Jeff and Anna welcomed their daughter to the world, Jeff would leave his parents' home and move into Bruce and Melinda's home.
And almost immediately after he moved in, he and the rest of Anna's family began experiencing some very strange and disturbing things around their property. Just a few days after Jeff had moved in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor of the house and they were having dinner at the kitchen table. And at some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. And now this property had this huge sprawling backyard. Basically, they had all these houses kind of in a row and they all had almost like a communal backyard, this big open space. And so Jeff is looking out into this huge backyard and he sees off in the distance something strange. He doesn't really know what he's looking at because it's nighttime, it's dark, but he stands up and he walks over to the window. And as he's looking out, he sees way off on the backside of their property are these 4 strangers just standing there appearing to be smoking something. And they're just kind of looking up at the Pleskovic house. And so Jeff is looking out the window at these 4, not really sure what to make of them. And he calls Anna over. And so Anna walks over and the 2 of them are looking out, not really sure what to do. I mean, on the one hand, these 4 people who they clearly didn't know, or they believed they didn't know, were definitely trespassing. But at the same time, they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of standing there smoking. But as they're watching these 4 people, one of them begins walking up the property towards their home and then stops alongside the Pleskovic trampoline, which was in their backyard. And this person begins fiddling with the trampoline. And so at this, Anna's like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing. I feel totally uncomfortable. And so Anna would actually call the police. And so the police, they come out, but by the time the squad car arrived in front of the Pleskovic house, the 4 people in back must have seen the car and they took off running. And so when the police officer went in the backyard and looked around, there was no one there. And there was also no sign they were there. There was no dropped cigarette butts or anything. They just kind of vanished. And so the police officer told Jeff and Anna, if they come back, let us know. And so the officer left. And then a little while later, when Bruce and Melinda came home, Jeff and Anna would tell them about what happened. And they would agree that that was totally strange, that in all the decades they had lived in Strongsville, they had never had anybody stroll onto their property and just loiter in the middle of the night. And so for the next couple of days, the family was definitely on edge. But after a little while, this whole incident was largely forgotten about. Fast forward about 5 months to November 2016, and Anna was home alone with her young daughter, and she's playing with her daughter on the first floor of the house towards the front of the house. And as she's playing with her daughter, she suddenly hears what sounds like someone trying to open the back sliding glass door on the back of the house. And so instinctively, Anna thinks, okay, Jeff must be out there or my parents must be out there and they don't have a key or something. And so she scoops up her daughter and she begins walking towards the back of the house to open this door for them. And when she walks into one of the back rooms, before she reaches the back door, she happens to look out one of the windows that looked out into the backyard. And standing right up against the glass is this unknown male figure with his face pressed up against the glass. And so Anna just freezes and stares at this guy, and then this guy, he notices Anna and he ducks down out of view. And now Anna's thinking to herself, this is the guy. He must have been trying to break in my back door. I'm home alone. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if he's going to try to break in again. And so she just turns and runs back towards the front of the house. She runs upstairs. She goes in a bedroom. She locks the door and she calls the police. But by the time the police come out there and they look around, they can't find this unknown figure that was at the back of the house. And there's no sign of an attempted forced entry. And so unfortunately, they told her, look, I'm sure this was very traumatic for you, but there's really nothing we can do here. There's no evidence to suggest who did this. And so please just, keep your house locked. And if you see anybody suspicious on your property, call us back. And so naturally, after the police left and Anna had a chance to contact Jeff and her parents, they were horrified and they rushed home to comfort her. And then after the initial shock of this incident had worn off, the family began to speculate, do you think this might be connected to those 4 strangers we saw on our property a few months ago? It just seems odd that those 2 things would happen so close together. And then the family began to think, okay, well then who is this person? Who are these people? What do they want? Why are they targeting us? What's going on? Because as it was, the Pleskovic family, they didn't have any enemies, at least none that they knew of. If anything, the people of Strongsville adored this family, especially Melinda, the mother. For the past 20 plus years, she had been a middle school teacher in town and her students adored her. She was also a big-time soccer coach in the community because she had played in college and she was still very passionate about it. So she was this amazing coach. And in the eyes of many parents in the Strongsville community, Melinda was a bit of an inspiration because she was not only the mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him where she was so good to him. She incorporated him in everything. She got him so involved. She gave him the best life he could possibly have. And so anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, Kyle would be all smiles. Even though Kyle couldn't speak, it was so obvious his mother made him incredibly happy. But regardless of the reason for these strangers to be lurking around their property, the Pleskovic family was now totally on edge and found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, in fear these strangers were going to come back and might try to break in again. And unfortunately, these strangers would come back. In January of 2017, so 2 months after Anna saw that unknown figure at the window and heard the back door sliding around, Bruce's car was broken into. It was sitting in the driveway of their property. Someone got inside of it and stole his laptop. And so Bruce, he calls the police and he says, I've got to believe this has to do with the people that are harassing my family. And the police believed him and they began looking around and asking around, but they could never track down the laptop or the thief. And so once again, the family was kind of left on their own. And the police said, look, if you see anything else, let us know, but there's not much we can do here. A few months later, in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night when Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on their first floor, and out on the very back of the property were 3 strangers just standing in that same spot where they saw those 4 strangers smoking the year before. And these 3 strangers are just standing there looking up at the house. And so horrified, Anna calls out to Jeff and says, look, there are 3 people in the back of our property. And so Anna, she pulls out her phone and she's calling the police. And as she's calling the police, Jeff, who's totally upset that there are these people harassing him and his family and making them feel unsafe, he just grabs a flashlight and storms out the back door to go confront these people. But as soon as Jeff went out the back door, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people had turned and ran and vanished. And so finally, when the police did show up, they were aware of all the calls they had gotten from this family. And so they went out there and they did a serious search for these 3 strangers. But like always, nothing was found. And so the family once again was told, if you see anything else, let us know. The following month, which was August, Anna was home with her daughter, along with her mother, who was upstairs. And as Anna is in the front of the house in the playroom with her daughter, she hears the sound of somebody trying to open that back sliding door. And now immediately her radar is up because she knows what happened the last time she heard the sound. There was that person in the window. But she's thinking, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if there's someone that I know at the back door. And so she scoops her daughter up, she stands up, and she walks around to the edge of the room she's in, and she kind of peeks her head down this hallway that will give her a clear view of this backsliding glass door. And once she finally has a full view of whoever is there, she screams because there are 2 large adults, as she would say, standing at the back door trying to force open this door. And so when she screams, these 2 strangers, they hear it, they turn around and they run. And Melinda, she was upstairs, she hears her daughter screaming, she comes flying downstairs, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Anna is hysterical, the baby's crying. And so Melinda actually calls the police about what her daughter has just seen. The police come out, they search the property, they can't find anyone. And so again, the police leave and they tell the family, look, I'm sorry this is happening to you, but we can't do anything. So please just let us know if anything else happens and we'll be out here as soon as we can. We're bound to catch these people, but right now we just don't have much to operate on. The following month, which was September, one of Melinda's car keys would go missing. And whoever had these keys, whoever had stolen these keys, would use it to randomly start Melinda's car in the middle of the night. And they also used it to set off her car alarm at odd hours of the night. And then also during this time frame that her keys were missing, they also discovered that there were nails jammed into the tires of Bruce's car. And so, of course, the family calls the police and tells them about what's going on, but the police can't do anything. And so very frustrated, Melinda actually takes to Facebook and posts that someone's stolen her keys and please just give them back. And just overall, she's pleading with whoever is harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, this post would not do anything. The harassment would continue. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the backsliding glass door rattling, and now he knows that every time this has been heard by Anna, that there's always some stranger at the back door. And so Jeff grabs the family dog and he very carefully turns and looks down that hallway towards the back door to see who this is, and right as he pokes his head out, he sees there's this large adult figure with a hood up trying to open this back door. And so the dog sees this person and starts barking and running towards the door. Jeff runs after the dog, and this big person outside who's trying to break in, he sees the dog, he sees Jeff running, and he turns and he runs away. And so Jeff and the dog, they stay inside the house and they watch this guy just take off across the property and disappear into the trees. And Jeff would call the police, but like always, the police came out and there just was nothing they could do. 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, they went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked to have dinner there and have Anna wait on them. And then after they were done eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, they left the restaurant, they hopped in their cars, and they drove back to their house. When they got there, Bruce was the first up the steps, and he got to the front door and it was locked, and so he knocked. And Kyle, his son, he came and unlocked the door. Bruce went inside, followed closely behind by Jeff, who was holding his daughter. They get inside, and Bruce walks through the house to the back of the house where the kitchen is. He flips on the lights, and there's something on the kitchen floor. And when Jeff sees it, he immediately turns around and runs out of the house carrying his daughter. He grabs Kyle along the way and just takes them straight out of the house. And then once Jeff was outside, he called 911. And when you listen to his 911 call, it sounds like Jeff is unable to process what he has just seen.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Somebody's been attacked in my house.
Somebody's been what?
Attacked.
They attacked who? Who was attacked?
Mel Pleskovic. Mel Pleskovic was attacked.
He was attacked by whom? Do you know?
She was. No, we just came home. She's on the kitchen floor.
Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda lying on the kitchen floor. She'd been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She would be rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. Although the family was in shock and couldn't even begin to process what had just happened, they were all acutely aware that whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of these strange and suspicious people that had been lurking around their property for the better part of 2 years. In fact, literally after Jeff had called 911, Bruce was inside in the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, and he called 911 and he would tell the dispatcher that the Strongsville Police Department really dropped the ball.
911, what city is the emergency in?
Please come to 1 Blazing Star. I think my wife's dead. We've had people breaking into our f***ing house,
Sir.
and now someone killed her.
Sir, tell me the city you need to talk to.
Strongsville, Ohio.
Okay, you need to be transferred. Don't hang up.
911, what's the city of your emergency?
Strongsville, Ohio. We have people on the way already.
What's the address?
4 Blazing Star. I think someone killed my wife.
You think someone killed your wife?
Yeah, it looks like she has stab wounds on her back. We've had people trying to break into our house all year. Stealing.
Sir, I need to ask you questions, okay? Are you there right now?
I just got in the door with my new son-in-law. My son Kyle was here with her.
Sir, what I want you to do is walk out.
The Strongsville Police Department would come out in force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they went public with who killed Melinda, no one could believe it. Back on October 23rd, so this was the night Melinda was discovered, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Melinda and her son Kyle, they were all together in the house. And at some point, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen and then went into the kitchen where Melinda was, and he walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over 35 times. And then when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff drew a gun and shot her 3 additional times to make sure she was dead. Now, while he was doing this, his daughter is literally just a few feet away, and Kyle, presumably, is also right nearby, but he has no way of understanding what's happening to his mother. And so with these 2 totally innocent lives just right nearby, Jeff would clean off his weapons and he'd take off his bloody clothes and he would hide them inside of his car, and then he would just scoop up his daughter and he would leave the house, leaving Kyle alone in the house with his dying mother in the kitchen, just leaves him there, shuts the door, locks it, and then Jeff and his daughter would drive to Applebee's to have dinner with Melinda's husband and her daughter. And then after several hours, when they got back to the property, Jeff knew what was waiting for them inside, and he still allowed Bruce to go inside first and discover his dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has actually never come out and given his motive for the crime. The running theory is that Jeff actually was not going to be able to pay for the wedding, which was coming up in a couple of days, and the wedding venue had actually contacted Melinda and said, hey, we're canceling the wedding because your future son-in-law can't pay for it. And so Melinda apparently confronted Jeff about his financial troubles, and the theory is he snapped and killed her. However, that can't possibly be the entire story for why he did this, because it would turn out Jeff was found to be responsible for literally every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the attack. Meaning every time they had seen strangers lurking around their property or people trying to break into their house, that had been because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff outside being one of these suspicious people, or he had asked friends or hired someone or groups of people to pretend to be suspicious people on the property, or Jeff had been the only person to see these suspicious people, and then miraculously when other people attempted to look outside, they were gone. And so obviously Jeff was lying. And so I actually had the opportunity to speak with one of Jeff's childhood friends who was actually living roughly in the Strongsville area when this horrible murder took place. And what this person told me is that what is kind of generally accepted as why Jeff did this, according to the people in Strongsville, is that Jeff apparently loathed Melinda. Even though she had opened her house to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in 2016, he began plotting to kill her. And so all of these suspicious events were Jeff's attempt at building this really intricate alibi that they had these strangers out there that were targeting this family. And so that when she would ultimately be killed by him, it would look like these strangers had done it. And at first, it totally worked. Everybody believed, the police, the family, friends, that strangers had broken into the house and killed Melinda. In fact, there was so little suspicion on Jeff after her murder that Jeff actually served as a pallbearer in Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and some bloody clothes in the back of Jeff's car, and so they would arrest him and they would present this mountain of evidence against him, and Jeff would confess to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He would just basically say, yes, I did kill her. He would also never give an apology or explanation to the family. He would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was this totally heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. And he would say their son, Kyle, does not understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle really likes to do and he used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window, eagerly expecting his mother to show up any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to curl the 5-star review button's hair for their wedding, but then repeatedly touch the top of their ear with the curling iron. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel